On behalf of the History Department and with support from Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, thank you for taking time together to join together in person and on Zoom. We're here to learn about the current crisis in Ukraine, to learn a little about how we have arrived at this tragic moment, and to demonstrate our solidarity with the Ukrainian people, as well as the many citizens of other countries who find themselves in harm's way in Ukraine. When we organized this a week ago, we had no idea how big it would get. There are over 500 people joining us from Zoom around the world. I'd like to introduce our three speakers. Daria Karpenko is a junior film photography and visual arts student at Ithaca College, who's also minoring in marketing and legal studies. She's from Dnipro, Ukraine, and finished 2 high school degrees, one in Ukraine and another one in Great Britain. She came to the US to study film and photography. Zenon Wasyliw needs no introduction. Professor of history, has been at Ithaca College since 2 years after I graduated from college. He's a specialist on Russian, Ukrainian, and Soviet history, and has published and taught widely on these areas. He is also a very beloved teacher who has trained generations of Ithaca College students, many of whom are joining us over Zoom. Again, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to our guests for joining us as well.
Hello to all alums. It's nice to see you. I've heard a lot from all of you, and you're always part of the Ithaca College community. Telling a historian to only spend 10 minutes on something is like an introductory part. So I'm going to focus more on Ukrainian history because that's one narrative that's been often ignored. One of the issues is Americans and others will say it's all about NATO or it's about the USSR and reconstructing the USSR. NATO did play a role, but really it's not about reconstructing the USSR. If you've been following Putin and his inner circle, it's about reconstructing a Russian empire from the 19th century. Those of you who had me in class, the foundation of this state was autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality, and a lot of it is attempted to be brought back. And in the 19th century, late 19th century, this is when you had absolutism. Ukrainian was banned from being spoken or written. This is when you had the pogroms taking place, where some of you might be here because of that reason. So, just as a context, there is history very much at play. Reconstructing an imagined past, that is very dangerous. Autocracy, you can just see the president of Russia sitting at big tables with the old Tsarist flag, only having a small circle of advisors back from his KGB days. And also there are people who say he's the richest man in the world of $200 billion in wealth. I saw an interview with Tom Brokaw just the other day when the Soviet Union collapsed, and he said, I'm sorry that the USSR collapsed, but not because of any communist policy or socialist policy or progressive policy. He thought it was foolish. It was seen as a continuation of empire. Now, in coming in, we have to realize cataclysmic events that would occur in Ukrainian history. At the end of the First World War, you had the construction of new nations. Ukraine did declare independence. It was short-lived, from 1918 to perhaps 1921. But the strength of this identity, the strength of the movement, led Lenin in creating the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and offering the creation of Ukrainian Republic. There was a process of indigenization, allowing people to get educated, allowing people to flourish. This would be considered the 1920s Ukrainian Renaissance, yes, in the Soviet Union. We've heard of other Renaissance in terms of culture and events. And the issue was, even within the Ukrainian Communist Party, you had a push for greater identity, for greater independence, and things of that nature. It was such a movement of Ukrainianism that you had even the former president of Ukraine, the historian Hrushevsky, coming back and living there, because the promise was true indigenization, true equality and things of that nature. The reality happened that when Stalin took power, you had this indigenization taking place, greater assertiveness. It wasn't only Ukrainian being taught, but Yiddish was encouraged to be taught, Polish, Tatar, and things of that nature. When Stalin came in, he was greatly worried because the people weren't becoming ideologically communist in many ways. And so you have a change in policy, and in order to crush, how can I put it, civic initiative on the part of the Ukrainian village, you have the introduction of an artificial famine. Taking the food away, and it wasn't just an attack on the farmers, it wasn't just an attack on control, it was also an attack on any idea of autonomy, because with archives just opened up, we've learned that there was armed resistance on the part of the Ukrainian peasants, on the part of Ukrainian farmers. And so even though over 4 million people perished, it was really quieted. And what's interesting is the first American scholar to start studying this, James Mace, who was a friend of mine, excuse me, was of Cherokee background. He saw this situation parallel to what happened to Native Americans, a trail of tears. We became good friends, and there was a lot of resistance to this. So when we talk about survival and trauma, the trauma of the First World War, the trauma of the Revolution, the trauma of famine. After the famine, elites were purged. Elites were sent into Siberia. So Stalin kind of has control, and then you have the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and once again, you have another traumatic effect. As the Nazis move in, we see the implementation of the Holocaust. A lot of historians have ignored that many of the lives lost, much of the brutality took place between Russia and Germany. Timothy Snyder wrote Bloodlands, and he brought up, this is where the Holocaust of Jews took place, racial categorization. With the Ukrainian population, they were considered Untermenschen, lower peoples, and were taken away for slave labor. I had 2 aunts and an uncle, 2 uncles and an aunt who were taken away. I had an uncle who perished in the Soviet army. And so there was resistance to Nazism. Some thought, oh, these are going to be liberators, and we knew that wasn't going to be the case at all. So you have this trauma over and over again. With the death of Stalin, we see Khrushchev taking over, and interestingly enough, you see a rise up again in trying to gain greater autonomy. The leader of the Ukrainian Communist Party, Sheles, will write a book, Oh My Ukraine. There was a 60s generation, poets, writers, an interest in bringing back this indigenous culture that was being crushed. Was it going to be allowed to happen? 1972, a decree came down, shut down all the Ukrainian language schools. So almost all of them shut down. That's why when you hear, oh, Russian-speaking cities in Kharkiv and elsewhere, it was part of the policy. They said no native language taught. Dissidents, activists, you actually had a close collaboration between Ukrainian activists and Jewish refuseniks at this time, and especially with the Helsinki Accord of 1975. And I'm not going to go into details, but this was an agreement by the Soviet Union and everyone to respect human rights. And so you have this activity, greater support from peace groups, from human rights groups, etc. But then, this is terrible to say, but the big blast that happened was Chernobyl. It really showed the disregard of the Communist Party, the apparatus, toward the general citizen, kind of a stagnation period. And then as we know, you have 1990, 1991 protests taking place. And part of it was university students being part of the Granite Revolution, calling for independence. 1991, Ukraine becomes independent. And then in the December of 1992, in a referendum, 92% of the population votes for independence. Now, will this be a smooth transition to democracy? No, and I'm not going to go into the rise of oligarchs, the rise of corruption. But you see the rise of a civil society with young journalists, and it'll be a new generation that's going to try and bring about change. 1994, another highlight, Ukraine was the had the third most nuclear weapons. Third in the world, and they agreed to sign the Budapest Memorandum. They gave up all their nuclear weapons, and in the process there was supposed to be a guarantee of keeping sovereignty, allowing for independence, which was not followed. There would be struggles with building a civil society, rule of law. Increasingly, Ukrainians were seeing the European Union as being a better promise for maintaining or developing rule of law, human rights, democracy of that sort. But the authorities at hand were often crushing and arresting. But nonetheless, you had elections. Even the pro-Russian, someone who maintained neutrality, Kuchma, wrote a book, Ukraine is not Russia. Get it, guys? Stop it. 2004, the Orange Revolution. Based on the movement used Gene Sharp's, I don't know if you ever heard of Gene Sharp, Peaceful Resistance. And he wrote a book, From Dictatorship to Democracy. I met the person who translated the work into Ukrainian. He's now head of archives of the secret police archives. And so it was a successful, peaceful revolution, but culture is a lot harder to change. And I'm really shortening things. 2013, 2014. In 2013, the corrupt ruler, and we find out that Manafort, yes, was his advisor, among other things, had promised to sign a European Union agreement and did not. Mustafa Naim, an Afghan refugee journalist, other journalists, students started using Facebook, Twitter, and saying, if you don't like this, join us in Maidan. They gathered, and guess what happened? They were beaten. Other people got upset, and soon you have over 500,000 people gathering, all sorts of people. And in reality, many were saying anti-corruption, but the big thing is they were flying European Union flags. They wanted that connection. 2014, the former president leaves, the opposition leaves, and now it's been kind of a new renaissance taking place. They've succeeded in making political candidates publicize their finances, other anti-corruption activities. Young people and others got a chance to travel to the European Union. And so there's been an opening up towards a civic identity. Not a nationalist ethnic identity, but a civic identity. One example is the religious pluralism. That's one of my research areas. An interfaith council gathers every year, and they rotate who leads it, and it includes all sorts of Christians, including Jehovah's Witnesses, Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Jews, Muslims, and others. So kind of a rise of a civil society, and I think the quintessential example of this was the election of Volodymyr Zelensky, a Russian-speaking person of Jewish background from the southern part of Ukraine, and he really expresses this idea of civic identity. Not nationalist, not extreme. There are, and you have to deal with it, but in reality, and then the push from the north has really united the country, and coming back to autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationality, we see the symbols of autocracy. Who's making decisions in Russia? Is there any shared governance? No. KGB buddies sit at a long table, wave these crazy historical fantasies of recreating something from the 19th century. Young people are trying to protest, and what's going on? They're protesting for peace, and they're beaten and arrested. There's even a law that's being put in the books. If you're arrested a second time, you can end up in jail for 20 years. Journalists are being killed. All of this is very cruel and controlling. It really isn't the fault of the Russian people, I will say, but autocracy, and this is what's happening in the world right now. Zelensky brought this up. We have to fight against autocracy. We have to fight for human rights, civic identity in terms of equality, and I think that that's part of it. So we have an autocrat, and that's enough. If you have any questions, I've made my point. I'm only warming up. I could go for another hour. That's okay. Go ahead.
Hi, everybody.
I'm sorry. I stayed to my time limit.
Wow, what a speech. I hope everyone can hear me on Zoom. Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming. It really means a lot. My name is Daria. I'm 21 years old, and I come from Ukraine. I was born there, and I lived there for 16 years of my life. And when this whole event was happening and organizing, I thought of what am I gonna talk about? Because I don't really know what to say, because who would have known, in the 21st century, it's something massive, something so horrible can happen. Because for the past week, all I've been feeling is obviously pretty isolated, but for many reasons, and one of them is that I feel like even when I'm gonna talk about my feelings and what's going on back home, I'm gonna be heard, but some of the information might not be fully processed. I'm sure most of you, I grew up listening to World War II stories, and it's a very big part of I guess growing up in Ukraine. Schools, summer camps, everything is so intertwined with World War II that in middle school, as a part of volunteering hours, my classmates and we went to visit this lady. She was a veteran and she was all alone. We brought her food and she started telling us stories because she was all alone and because she didn't have anyone to vent to about the terror that happened to her. She showed us pictures of her husband that never came back. And I remember when we left, all we could think about is how grateful we are. We never have to experience anything like that. I honestly don't know how to talk about war, but my grandma does, because it hit me yesterday that it's her second war. She spent her early childhood watching Nazis bomb Ukraine, killing our people, torturing. And now she's going through it all over again, but the people who are fighting against us are the people who we fought back to back with, who we called brothers and sisters. She would always tell me, with tears in her eyes, saying how grateful we all should be to veterans because, well, we can peacefully walk outside in the streets, live our lives, enjoy it. And I'm so sorry she has to go through it all over again. Stories, why would they matter? There's this article I came across by Harari, who's the author of the book *Sapiens*, if you know. It's the Guardian article, and he said that nations are built upon stories. Nowadays, everyone is a storyteller. we all go on Instagram, we post, Twitter, Reddit, you name it, TikTok, which has its benefits, right? Because now we're all this like big global community and we share our experiences, like even through pandemic. It really helped us and united us. But on the other hand, it's just, media gives so much power, and it gives power to privileged or chosen ones. And it's been really, really hard going online and seeing all these stories, and I'm sure for all of you. But let's be honest, as we watch it all happening online and then we just move on. Because we've seen enough. We've seen enough of these bloody pictures. We've seen enough of it, and we just lose our feelings to it. It just becomes numb, because every day we go and scroll on social media. And I don't know how we're going to give this, like, not even platform, how we're going to give this ability to actual war victims to talk about their trauma and being heard without being questioned whether or not their stories are true. Because maybe they don't have these pictures to show. I can't stop reading the news. I'm not there. I know I shouldn't, but I'm not there yet. Because I can't put my phone away and know that my family is like, and friends are like safe, because I just want to keep checking. And while being on the phone, reading the news, I've encountered so many videos and so many people sharing their own opinions about what's going on, which includes not only like Russian influencers talking about how Russian soldiers are on a mission to save Ukrainian people from neo-Nazis, and that they're not bombing civilians. Well, every day, my family and friends see people die. And I feel like this is the issue of the 21st century, because, how we can all care. Because once again, social media kind of numbs it. And why would we even all care if it's just happening somewhere there, far away? I don't really know how to answer, because it's such a complex issue, especially in Western countries that are built upon individualism. But I feel like maybe we should all care, because that's what our generation is like. We are all left with such a burden of like climate change and wars all over the world, caused by greedy people who they can't give up their throne and their wealthy castles and power. Maybe we should all care, because it's the world's issue. As for 80 years, everyone was saying never again. But for the first few days of the war, all of the Western countries seemed to be hesitant and confused, while some children in Kiev and Kharkiv and many other cities were spending their second night underground, falling asleep to the sound of explosions. I think we should all care, because it's our future. And living abroad for 5 years, it has like created this abyss between my family and I. Since I'm just used to seeing them twice a year and talking over the phone most of the time, and it's just, you get used to it. And all I know is like they're far away, somewhere there, 3,000-4,000 miles away. And this war has tore it further apart. I don't know what to feel, but now I can't. Every time I tear up every time I think of the warmth of my mom's arms when she hugs me. As when I returned back home, and then growing up, I just didn't like when my dad would give me advice or just like a lesson whenever I screw up. But now I really need it because I don't know what to do in such challenging times. I cry every night because I remember how in one of my human rights assignments I wrote that I'm gonna protect and teach like my younger siblings about human rights and just be there for them. And to my siblings, to all the children back home in Ukraine, and to just children in general who had to unfortunately find out what the word war means and looks like, I'm so sorry. I'm truly sorry the war has stolen your childhood moments, forcing you to grow faster. I wish this never occurred, and I'm sorry we failed you, but we're doing our best to protect you and fight for your future and for a bright and peaceful future. I was on the phone with my dad yesterday, just asking him generic questions, how are you? How are kids doing? And he told me that they miss me very much. And they constantly keep asking him, when are they going to see me? Soon, I said, and my dad added, right after our victory. Thank you so much, and Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!